I want you to talk a little bit about the morality of institutions, which is obviously going downhill. You obviously think about it from looking at your writing too. I'm very concerned about it and wondering what our job should be.
It seems to me that this is a very major problem. I mean, the morality of institutions reflects the morality of the people in them and the expectations of the public. And I think it's just become so much lower. As I've mentioned before, I think one of the things that distresses me as a conservative, and in political terms as well as just generally, that I have a number of friends, people who I respect and like, who are big Donald Trump fans.
Yeah.
And to me, this is just incomprehensible. And now you've got these riots in the United States, and it seems to me that a lot of people on the what one might call the other side, intellectually, seem to be rather happy that there are riots. And this to me is just inexplicable.
Well,
That there is injustice and protest, fine, but this is that you'd welcome. This strikes me as a real Yeats kind of the best lack all conviction.
The Trump effect is not incomprehensible to me. When he was elected, I understood, because I come from a blue-collar background, and I knew how alienated working people have been over my lifetime. My grandfathers on both sides were toolmakers. Several of my uncles were. They were proud men. They could work to a 10,000th of an inch. But of course, then computer-assisted design arrived, and 10,000ths of an inch was nothing. And they were out of work overnight. That totally demoralizing. And since the 50s, I mean, we've had an incredible expansion of the economy, and everybody, even those who are on welfare have got a DVD player, a television, sometimes a car, things we would never have dreamt of. But a group of people, blue-collar guys, have got left out of this process, and their families, and they were angry. Roger Scruton noticed it on his trips to America and made the appropriate comment. So I wasn't surprised. It wasn't incomprehensible. I hope that it leads to somebody sitting down and beginning to think, okay, we owe them an apology. We put the economy above the people who live in the country.
Yeah, all of that, I think, is very true and very valid. And I see, as a historian, I see echoes of, the vote for Richard Nixon. I used to explain it, and only people of a certain age will get the reference. But Richard Nixon was elected by Fred Flintstone, essentially, who was by no means an economic conservative. He was a staunch union man. He was a patriot. But he was appalled at the disorder and the disrespect. And it's gotten 10 times worse. And part of what seems to be the polarization is that the people on the other side cannot see why anybody would support Donald Trump, and they don't want to know. My old schoolmate and friend, David Frum, he's got a filter on his computer now. He's incapable of tweeting anything that doesn't insult Donald Trump. And I've occasionally tried to draw him out and say, okay, so if Trump's as bad as you say, why do you think he's winning? What's wrong with your approach? And what I'm trying to get him to admit that there's a certain kind of condescending smugness here that is profoundly destructive. But the Democrats have found, Hillary Clinton, the one person probably in the whole United States who could have lost an election to Donald Trump, and they may be going to lose this one. I think politically the riots probably helped Trump, and yet you look at the commentariat; they don't seem to be worried about the riots, even from the political point of view, but let alone just riots are bad and they destroy neighborhoods. They evaporate trust. They eliminate jobs. They will leave. Look at Detroit. The 67 riot may have been cathartic in some sense, but the city never recovered from it. No. And yet they don't seem to think, okay, maybe this would be a good moment to say, we want law enforcement that is neither brutal nor racist, but everybody needs law enforcement, and none more so than those who are left out. You know what neighborhood a 911 call is going to bring a police car in 30 seconds, and what neighborhood it's not going to bring one in 30 minutes. And the commentators don't live in the 30-minute neighborhoods.
No. It's an interesting situation that we're in, but it's a crisis we need to use. If who was it? Obama's henchman said, "Don't let a crisis go to waste." and this is one that is getting very serious. Medicine, the law, journalism, teaching, the university are all losing public credibility.
As though they were trying to. I mean, it's like I commented in a recent column about it seemed like the West was trying to throw the Cold War. And I mean, look at public school teachers are going on strike and demanding more money when they're already making way more than the average. And they have these pensions that ordinary people don't have. They're making far more money than the parents of most of the kids in their classes. And yet they have this aggrieved and tunnel vision that they can see nothing but that they are badly done to it and that money would make it hurt less. I agree.
And actually, the outcome of teaching is worse than it ever was.
Yeah, and yet some of that's not their fault. Nothing ever seems to be their fault. And again, well, one of my pet peeves lately is all these newspapers with their experts say on the most preposterous things experts say. But you have this class, the journalists are in it, and they know which professors to call who will be the experts who say, and they are not enhancing their credibility by always hitting one side of the issue as though only a fool or a rogue could possibly be on the other side. I mean, it's hard to admit that a person could be intelligent and well-meaning and yet disagree with my opinion even after they'd heard it. But it's true, and it has to be the starting point, is to realize that that's a human being opposite you who has their own thoughts in their own head and their own life and their own priorities, and that you need to somehow engage them and say, well, why? Why is it that you see it differently than me? And how can we at least have a civil discussion of our differences if we can't resolve them right here and right now?
Yeah. Well, the bottom line to me, of course, is that when you have a society that is effectively tacitly atheistic in practice, in other words, we're on our own. The lovely last paragraph but one in Leff's marvelous piece of 1978 or whatever it was, it looks to me as though we are all that we have. But he was Jewish and he was thoughtful. And he said, looking around the world, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. If brotherly love exists, the ruling model appears to be Cain and Abel. Only if the law was unnatural and unspeakable by us would it be unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything is up for grabs. And he nailed it.
Yeah, and it's curious too, because of course nothing is worth grabbing, right? Nothing has actual value, nothing has validity. And yet, while some people might choose to respond by lying down and dying or simply indulging in hedonistic pleasures, because even if you don't believe in certain things, they still feel good. A lot of people do what, as I argued I think at the last summer seminar, the Hitler-Mussolini route, where we will somehow fill the void with the power of our will and the savagery of our action. So to some extent, again, when you look at the riots in the United States, you think partly because it's genuine historical frustration, it's a pent-up anxiety and so on from the quarantine, but it's also an outburst of nihilism, that nothing matters, but at least I made a difference because I caused something to go up in flames. I caused something to break. For a moment there, I felt alive in a world that, as you say, doesn't give us any great reason to believe that we are alive. Or that if we are alive, that it means anything. It's just temporary and kind of unpleasant, and then we'll be dead. And I think, yes, it's a society that has lost its bearings and has lost the concept that there might even be bearings. And then again, C.S. Lewis, we castrate and bid the gelding
be fruitful,
And so, and that makes us look pretty silly. Like we may all be fools, but it doesn't mean we have to give in to it.
Well, logically, if you've accepted the Darwinian account of the world, everything is ultimately pointless. And we're surprised when we've been teaching our children now for N generations anyway, certainly since the 60s, that nothing is real, nothing matters, you're all an accident anyway, that they start behaving like an accident. Who should be surprised?
Yes, well, again, this happens in that hideous strength to Augustus Frost, that he's always theoretically believed that thoughts were irrational, and then he finds that his thoughts increasingly are irrational.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and we've talked a bit about this in terms of getting past the material veil, that to me, the funny thing is, it's not just that we're accidents. If the Darwinian theory is correct and complete, then our thoughts are a trick of the genes, that they are the result of electrochemical reactions that follow the laws of chemistry and physics. And if you could trace them all the way back to the Big Bang, and there were no moments of choice, there were no moments of decision, why we should be a ghost, why there should be a ghost in the machine watching this movie and having the illusion of choice, one cannot understand. But to me, this was not just a vision where nothing meant anything. It really, there was nothing. There was no me. There was no morality. There was no choice. Everything was a profound illusion. And I was sure that it was not. And I took the view that if your logic is sound, but your conclusion is intolerable, not just psychologically intolerable, but logically intolerable, then your premises must be wrong. And you have to go back and find the flaw in the premises. Not that my reasoning is necessarily flawless. I just played a couple of online games of chess where you might question whether I'm a rational animal at all. But this is one of the odd things, is that once you abandon reason, I suppose you stop thinking clearly about things. But you get into a situation. Lewis talked about this, about what after his wife had died, and said if she is not now alive, if her soul has not survived death, then she never was alive, and I somehow mistook a cloud of atoms for a person. And so in this sense, in the materialistic vision, you can't be unhappy because you don't exist. You're just a bag of water with things going sparkle, sparkle, fizz in them. And this epiphenomenon of your consciousness, which has no purpose, since you have no choices to make. Why there'd be a place where you think you're making choices is hard to understand. But logically, it is just an illusion. And so you're just an illusion. And if you're an illusion, you can't be unhappy. But if this makes you very unhappy, then you realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm unhappy. I have been unhappy for some time. Therefore, I exist. I persist through time. And therefore, there's something very wrong with the materialist vision. But if that's too cosmic, then I think just watching how people behave, if they believe what we've told them, they behave as though they believed it. And we go, oh, no, this is awful. Well, yeah, correct.
Well, the suicide anxiety stuff is making it very clear that we made a mistake. And you get people like Peterson and Rubin and Douglas Murray all recognizing maybe there is something, there has to be something beyond us.
Yeah, I was just looking at a thing about about the quarantine and the effect it's having, particularly on young people. And the news story just took for granted that, and of course, young people are the most stressed and unhappy. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. Aren't these the people who've thrown off all the prejudices and bourgeois constraints that were making us unhappy? Aren't these the ones who have been taught to be non-judgmental, and there's a rainbow flag in every classroom, and with judgy, that's what they call it, judgy, because judgmental is too long a word. And I've pointed this out, including to my own kids, that you say, don't be judgmental, and I make some remark, and you go, hey, Dad, that was terrible. It's like, well, you just judged me. Oh, yeah, well, we're allowed to judge that. I mean, it's not a sophisticated intellectual construct. It's not a very robust cage. And so I guess in that sense, the crisis gives us the opportunity to point out not only are you trapped, but you're trapped by bars of straw. If you push against them, they won't resist very hard. So let's get pushing. And if your life is completely meaningless, you haven't got much to lose, right? And we gamble on finding meaning.
Yep. I was looking at The Abolition of Man not long ago. I try and read it every 2 or 3 years. And I love that bit at the end of the first chapter where he says, he compares the much maligned Middle Ages with the modern man. I mean, he's writing in the 40s. He couldn't see just how far it was going to go. But he says, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform the soul to objective reality. That would be God. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. For the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to make reality suit us, and the way forward is technique. I haven't done the quotation justice in terms of its lucidity, but he's right. Now, everything is process. Even in the university medical school, if they go about it in the right way, it's okay. The fact that they got it wrong doesn't seem to matter, and that the patient might die as their way of learning a bit more.
And again, as Lewis points out, the irony of it is just as our technique becomes so impressively powerful, we've reasoned our way away from believing that there is any ultimate purpose, so we don't know what to do with the technique. He puts it that just at the moment that we conquered nature, it conquered us.
Yes.
And to go from Lewis to a complete opposite extreme, but I'm actually, in a weird way, I'm very impressed by H.P. Lovecraft. who's
Going back a bit.
I encountered one more gambrel roof, I shall admit an eldritch scream. But one of the things about Lovecraft, he creates this cosmology with the Necronomicon, and you find God, and he's a completely idiotic character. Because if you don't find God, there's always the hope that I might find him tomorrow. But Lovecraft is saying, what happens if you do find the ultimate secret to life, the universe, and everything, and it is 42? Then you can't keep looking, and you just collapse. And I think this is part of the problem, is that in a way we're no longer, even in the 40s and 50s, when this illusion of technique was gaining force, people thought that there might be something there. And now we're into, again, I talk about this in one of my lectures, Logan's Run, a much neglected movie based on an absolutely terrible book. But in Logan's Run, the quest for meaning has been abandoned for the quest for pleasure, because people have just decided it's not there. But of course, at the end of the movie, then Logan and Jess start to rebuild it. They discover that you can, in fact, find something that matters enormously. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but they live in this kind of dystopian world where there's a whole lot of what, but there's no love, there's no marriage, parents don't raise their own children. Yep. And they finally get out, and among other things, they find a cemetery. And they're reading the headstones and going, this is very strange, these names and these dates. And then it says, beloved wife and beloved husband. And they look at each other and they say, I wonder what that means. But later on, they find one person who's actually survived in the outside world, and he explains it to them. And then they turn to each other, and she says, beloved husband, and he says, beloved wife. And so, again, I think that the modern world is a huge wreck, but it's also, the cage, I repeat, the cage is fragile. As the world in Logan's Run falls apart, the computer can't handle the truth. And then all the people come out and see that there is much more to it. And I think everybody knows it's meant to mean something. That's what I meant about the conclusion that you don't exist being intolerable, because it's written on the heart that something matters.
Yes. Yep.
And
how did
so
you get on with your students, your first year, so to speak?
Sorry?
How did you get on with the students this year? They're different from the standard secular bunch, aren't they?
Yeah, in some ways, it made life a lot easier as a lecturer. I'd commented a number of times to them that I would have to do a whole lot of very basic backfilling here with most of my University of Ottawa classes that I don't have to do with you. On the other hand, it was important to realize, we have to see this from the point of view of the outside world. Some of them, I think, felt that my course didn't quite connect with the curriculum the way everything else did. But that was partly because I'm thinking you may be at Augustine College, but you are an island of faith in a sea of unreflective disbelief. And you need to be able to meet that world on its own terms and deal with it and talk to it. You need to understand its challenges, and you need to be able to help communicate to people, because they've never heard any of this. And when you first try and explain it, I have noticed this with people who are intelligent, one might call them open-minded, not lacking in conviction, but and you can talk to them on almost any subject and challenge them and have interesting debates. But when you start to talk about Christianity, they stuff their ears with the most preposterous bric-a-brac to stop it from even starting to get in. And part of the reason, I think, is that people feel that there's something there, and it's something challenging and in some ways dangerous. Again, Lewis talks about this, that it's all fine and good to think about God in the abstract, but when you pull on the string and somebody pulls back, this is very alarming. Yes. Or there's one, I can't find it now. I write everything down because I have CDO, which is like, OCD, but in alphabetical order, as it should be. And yet he talks about the terrifying feeling of a door closing with you inside. And,
yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do have a kind of instinct that I'm not ready for that, but it's going to happen if I don't look out.
Go back to way back when you wrote the lovely Why Taking History Seriously Can Make You Very Cross. If you redid it today, what would you make the turning point of history?
The turning point of history would clearly be the resurrection. And again, if people would listen, and they often will not do so. So I've just realized I've got my name on the screen as Augustine College. Never mind that. Sorry, folks. But there's an irrelevancy in the middle of all this. There's the human mind for you. That Christ goes around telling people they should be nice to each other for a change, and then he gets killed, and you're thinking, well, that's just about the way life goes. But then the disciples say he's not dead. He rose from the grave. And people are like, you're insane. And this is proof of it. And then more and more people start saying, hey, wait a minute, I saw him. And this is an extraordinary moment in history. Lots of people have said they were divine, and lots of people have pretended to believe it if the alternative was death. But very few people have really believed it. And then you get this guy who nobody believes pretty much while he's alive. We don't know how many did. But then when he's resurrected, and this is in Acts where Luke says, you may think this is a silly story, but thousands of people have seen him. Go ask them. And although we can't ask them today, at the time that he made that challenge, had it been an empty one, there'd be no Christianity. And I think that this is where enough people were convinced that he did what it took to prove that what he was claiming was true. His forgiving of sins, his I send you prophets, all that stuff that in the beginning was the word. He performed enough miracles that people went, okay, the claim is preposterous, but to deny it would be more preposterous still, because then how did he do that? And after that, history changes. Tom Holland's book Dominion, where he realizes that, I'm talking about the traditional family, and I've come to realize, reading Roman history and stuff, the traditional family is the Christian family. Yep. It is not the family of the pagans. It is not the family of the pre-Christian world. Not even the family of the Jews. Although their family is close, but they had polygamy. So this is where I think it all pivots. But one of the interesting things about that column is, at the time that I wrote it, I was not a Christian. Yep. And in some sense, therefore, the original version is useful, because this is somebody who is finding that what they had believed couldn't hold together. And not just metaphysically, but again, as a historian, I get a lot of abuse for being a historian. People keep saying, oh, you're a historian, you know nothing. It's like, well, thank you for that. But treating the problem of Christianity as a historian and seeing how odd it was, and saying either you just brush this off and sort of sacrifice your intellect in the process, or else you take it seriously and you say, well, how could it be? How could these people who were, Peter's a fisherman, right? Who takes advice from fishermen? A tax collector, there's a despised profession. That hasn't changed much. Yeah. Some of them probably had a little more social cachet, but how did these people persuade the whole world that a dead Jewish carpenter was God? You're starting in a hole with that one. That famous line from some barbarian king who gets converted during the Dark Ages and says at the crucifixion, if I and my warriors had been there, he would not have been killed. And that's, of course, a pagan view of what God is meant to be like, even after being converted. But that was, and I remember I wrote a column even before that about what the most important person of the millennium, and I picked William the Conqueror, thinking at the time that the Norman Conquest probably was the most significant event in the last 1,000 years. The more I looked into Magna Carta, the less certain I was of that. But even then I said, and if you want to go back 2,000 years, it's Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not. Yeah. The world is so different after Christ than before. And then again, there are no more claims of divinity by a human ruler. So there are some hang on, right? Well, we were always gods, we still are. Shut up, don't ask questions. The Japanese emperor made it to 1945 on that one. But there are no new ones, and there are no new religions other than ones that claim to be the correction or fulfillment of Christianity, right? There's cults, but in terms of significant new religions, all you have is Islam and Mormonism, both of which are in that tradition. You say, well, how did that happen? How does a guy do that to world history? Especially if he says, hey, everybody, I'm God, and the Romans kill him. It's like, well, that wasn't all that godlike.
Let me read a paragraph to you. I won't make it difficult by not telling you who wrote it. This is from Fergusons' Civilization. I don't know if you've read it. Neil Ferguson.
No, he writes so many brilliant books that I utterly despise him and refuse to read them. I've read some of his stuff, but
yeah. Well, this one was sent to me by a friend, and when you open it up, he says he's going to deal with civilization by the apps of civilization, like computer apps, and he lists the ones that made the West possible as medicine, law, journalism, teaching, and the university. Sorry, wrong list. Competition, science, property rights, medicine, the consumer society, and the work ethic. Now, I sort of said, well, that's pretty old hat stuff in many ways. That can't be the reason he's writing the book. What he wants to say as a liberal is painful, but he wants to say it. I mean, he's conservative in some ways, but he's still very much part of the liberal establishment. And you get 3/4 of the way through the book, and he's in China. And he meets a scholar from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who's been funded to research into why the West succeeded. And this is what he writes. We were asked to look into what accounted for the preeminence of the West all over the world. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. Trudeau would.
And that's classic. One of the books that I tried to get the students to read, and I don't know if they read it or it was just long and they didn't even open it. Theodor von Lauer wrote a book called The World Revolution of Westernization. And von Lauer is an interesting character. He's a Quaker, and he's so far left that he actually comes out of the fog and starts making sense again. But he says, the initial impact of the West on other societies is the guns. The West shows up as superior military technique, and people think we should get some guns. But even once they do, they still lose the battles. And they realize there's a kind of an organization behind it. So they get interested in the political system. But then they say, but where's the political system get all this power? And they go, oh, it's the economy. That's what makes all those warships. That's what feeds all those soldiers. But then they say, but how do you have an economy in which people can be at once so disciplined and so free to exercise initiative? Where does that come from? And it does take it back to a religion that sees the face of Christ in every human being, great or small, that sees God in a baby, that does not simply think that might makes right, and that has room for all this kind of innovation, including the problematic stuff, right? The West terrifies people because it's always asking questions. It's tearing everything up. And as I put it to the students toward the end of the course, what if in this project of free inquiry was always implicit that we would turn on reason and saw off the branch we were sitting on? What if there was never any way of preventing that and no way of sticking it back on? But again, you look at the classical world, because a lot of what they were seeing is pre-Christian. The Greeks, for instance, are militarily so much more formidable than anybody else around them. The Spartans invent the dog tag, because when West fights West, the bodies are stacked 10 high. But of course, the Greek project of seeking liberty and free inquiry demolished the Olympian religion because it was stupid. And the Greeks sat there and said, our religion is stupid. This is terrible. And we must get rid of it and find something else. And so they started looking for a religion that wasn't stupid, a religion that genuinely could sustain the proposition that the world made sense and that human beings mattered. And so again, people like to describe Christianity as irrational, and just sort of crutch or something. Well, yeah, you try meeting God face to face and see how that goes. But it is ultimately the product of free inquiry. It is the one religion that doesn't say shut up and kneel down in one way or another. Even Buddhism doesn't like to threaten people. It's always surprising when Buddhists turn violent, as they have in some places in the world. But Buddhism is still kind of saying, close your eyes and just let go of everything. Whereas Christianity, Chesterton said this about the pictures of Buddha show him with his eyes closed, the pictures of Christ show him with his eyes open. It says, open your eyes. This is the world, and it is good. There's a lot wrong with it, and if you're wondering what it is, go find a mirror. But that the creation makes sense. It's not something to get away from. In Buddhism, you're just trying to get away from it. In the end, the creation is pointless, and somehow you salvage something from the wreckage by floating off downstream. But Christianity says the world makes sense, and that is again, that leads to all kinds of things, including gunboats, which are both good and bad. But yeah, I think those scholars were very right in tracing it back to a metaphysical foundation. It wasn't accidental. And it wasn't founded in something vicious. Even in von Lauer being a Quaker, he's so pacifist. In the end of his book, he says, we should leave the rest of the world alone. We're just scaring them. We're overwhelming them. It's like, well, that's easier said than done. We can't stop being ourselves. The West is this huge challenge to the world, as the Jews always were. the thing about anti-Semitism. Why do people hate the Jews so much? Well, so the Jews come along and say, there's one God, he knows everything, he sees everything, you can't bribe him, you can't fool him. He's got pretty high standards. If you're really sorry, he'll probably forgive you, but if you're just faking it, he's going to know. And people are like, well, I don't want to hear that. Go get the Jews.
Yeah.
And Christianity's the same way, but you can't pretend it's not there. You can't just say, oh, yeah, never mind that. That was just silly. That was all a big mistake. And the more you try, sort of the louder and more frantic you get.
Yeah, the pseudo debate about science and faith is the one that really intrigues me a lot, because if you go to an academic history of science conference, all the main speakers would agree to some proposition like this. Yeah, there are problems with faith, but let's be honest. The church was not a perfect patron of science, but it was the only patron of science. And it all grew out of that environment. And historians of science all accept that now. I mean, all this stuff about flat earth and the like, no Christian ever believed that. Time and time again, the books are written and people believe them that are absolutely fact-free when it comes to what actually happened historically. It's quite astonishing to me. And of course, you would never do an experiment if you didn't believe there was order beneath the surface that you look at. That underneath this great mass of activity, some of it looking pretty chaotic, but some of it looking just incredible, there's got to be order. That makes an experiment possible.
There's a logos. There's a word there. And that's one of the odd things about Aristotle, that he makes some very strange assertions because he didn't do experiments. But give him a break. He was just starting out. But yeah, he was convinced that there would be order. And then eventually we found a metaphysics that said, yes, there is order. And we have wandered this way and that, but it is, and again, I think part of the thing that maybe some people realize is that if you don't like the church as a patron of science, try the state and see how that goes. Lysenko is not an improvement.
But isn't it astonishing that Darwin should be so honored in the way that he is? Simply for giving them a way out, basically. Meanwhile, Mendel, who was alive at the same time and nobody took any notice, Darwin's going to be totally sidelined in a little while, except historically. Mendel, of course, is riding high and will continue to do so, way ahead of his time. And of course, genetics is so ordered, it is way beyond any possibility of a Darwinian explanation. I don't know if you've listened to John Lennox at all. Have you come across him yet?
Not even slightly.
You should try. He's a mathematical cosmologist from Oxford. His little book, Has Science Buried God, is brilliant. But effectively, the probability that the kind of information we find in DNA could happen by chance is roughly 1 for all the molecules in the cosmos. It couldn't happen. The numbers are so big, you can't even think about them.
Clearly, the universe is friendly to order. Again, some people have noticed these various fundamental numbers in the universe that make it possible that life could exist.
Yep. Even ones that we know exist and we don't know what they are, like the square root of -1.
Yeah, and if they were slightly different, it couldn't, and so you have the weak cosmological hypothesis, just we're here wondering about it only because the universe happens to be the kind of place where we're here wondering about it, and the strong one that it's designed. But I often say about people who take a too short-sighted a view of God and science is to say, don't sell God short, right? He's not lacking material. If God wanted to create an entire universe to put life on one planet, it's not like he'd be running out of money to buy the hydrogen atoms or something. If God incorporated evolution into the process whereby he created man, you're not going to get to the pearly gates and say, if it had been me, I'd have done it better. This would be an inappropriate response. But if you find him saying, well, yeah, evolution was an interesting theory, but I don't believe in it. Again, I presume that we don't start arguing with God. Again, Lewis has to see with us. I think it's in the Screw Tape Letters when the guy finally does make it to heaven, and he throws himself to the ground at Christ's feet and apologizes for his sins. And And then everybody finds themselves very funny, which I think is almost certainly something that's going to happen. I was thinking about that. I don't know if we're going to talk a bit about the historical path to conversion, but even after something happens, so you connect up the dots and you say, well, now I understand my life. I didn't plan it, but it seems to make sense in retrospect. It may well be that when we no longer see through a glass darkly, our account of how we got where we are will be as absurd as our plan for where we thought we were going. And then, I imagine somebody, I think it's from The Name of the Rose, that Venerable Jorge, who just hates laughter. And one of the things he says, that does not say anywhere in the scriptures that Christ laughed. And William of Baskerville is reduced to kind of feebly saying, well, it doesn't say he didn't either. But my guess is that heaven rings with laughter, that there is
Yes. Well,
one of the things that we do for eternity is just enjoy the mirthful spectacle of the preposterous stuff that we and others did.
Yeah. The funniest creature that God made is us. We are hilariously funny to just think about. Yeah, the fact that he doesn't say Jesus laughed, that I agree. I can't think where he says that, but he certainly had a sense of humor.
He made a pun, but it was about as good as a James Bond joke, however. Perhaps he didn't write them all down.
But I think it would be interesting to hear you think a little bit through the process of how we talk about our faith today. I mean, the only thing Jesus tells us to do is to go and tell what he did to us. I love it, for instance. One of my favorite experiences that happens every now and again is when I meet somebody on my speaking travels whom I'd met previously at international science conferences. And they're wandering around a university, see my mugshot, and I'm still recognizable. They turn up to the lecture. And then afterwards, a conversation like this will happen. Hello, I haven't seen you for a long while. I say, no, I don't go to the meetings where we used to meet anymore. He said, yeah, I used to read your stuff until the mid-90s. The clear implication being that I lost my mind in the mid-90s. And I say, you think I lost it? He said, well, you write rubbish now, don't you? I said, well, I think I can prove that you're wrong. What do you call somebody who's lost their mind? And he had to say mad or crazy. What happens to their life? Well, it falls apart. Well, you go ask my wife, and she's certainly honest on the wrong side of the account from my point of view, but she'll say, since I took faith more seriously, things got better, not worse. So my faith is not, as you would wish it to be, irrational, so much as supra-rational. Your faith in science cannot give you any meaning to what you do. You cannot derive an ought from a physical is. But there's plenty of room in my faith for doing reductionistic science. I think that's the right way to do it. And the golden age of science, the 17th century, of the top 200 scientists, 90% of them call themselves Christian, half of them devoutly. It's not incompatible. It, in fact, fired the whole thing up. You need to recognize that scientific reductionistic rationality is very good, but it is not a total explanation.
And this, again, in a more broad sense, when people tell me Christianity is stupid, I say that is in itself is not a very thoughtful statement. A great many highly intelligent people have been Christians. They may have been wrong. Christianity might be vicious, but to call it stupid, even I'd say, why don't you read Pope Benedict's Life of Jesus of Nazareth? And you can even follow it, not because it's confused, but because it's so brilliant and so tight. You need a different critique of Christianity than that it's stupid. That one is again the bric-a-brac. That stops you from taking things seriously that might cause you problems if you did. But that's not very dignified. You'd rather be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. Well, in that case, you need to ask yourself that. And I like your point about people's lives falling apart or coming together. My mother used to say that the difference between crazy and eccentric is your bank balance. But because the serious point being, if you're crazy, your life falls apart. If you just have an odd way of doing things, you can hold it together and get a lot done. I mean, there's more to life than money, but in the broader sense, I think that's a very, very important point. And you see this, of course, with other things, the prison conversion experiences. And you say, well, you could say a lot of sarcastic things about this, but normally the person winds up being a better human being and a better prisoner. So you think, or that line you hear from them, even the people doing life in prison for terrible crimes, would say, for the first time in my life, I'm free.
Yep.
I'm free from the lies. I'm not free from sin, but I'm free from justifying sin.
Yep.
It's enormously liberating
Yep.
just to stop making excuses for stupid stuff that you did, and say, yeah, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Be a sinner. Yep.
You like that? I like that one too, because there's no rationalization. There's none of this trimming where you say, well, I sort of sinned. But on the other hand, it's
Well,
just,
most people don't even use the word sin at all now,
I just
because
lay my cards on the table.
once you give up on objective moral truth, since sin is going against objective moral truth, and if it doesn't exist, sin doesn't exist. And I say to students, that's why you're in such trouble. The only solution to real sin is real repentance and forgiveness. But you don't believe in them, so they don't make sense to you. You're stuck.
Yeah, everything's a medical condition now.
Yes.
My father used to call himself ethically challenged. Actually, my father was an atheist, but he had a sense of humor and he was no fool. But this is even in the first Incredibles movie, where the villain is called Syndrome, I think was a shot at this whole kind of weird metaphysics. But yeah, everything now. And they say, well, we're going to have therapy, and no matter what you did, sooner or later we'll cure you. Again, I'm going to steal a bit from one of my talks. I don't know if this is going before or after the lecture, but it'll all,
Yes.
This colleague of mine at the Citizen, a real old-time journalist, like he's such an old-time journalist, he worked at the paper when it made money, but he wrote a novel about journalism where somebody says The Dirty Vicar is the best story there is. And I even thought at the time, and it's far more true now, the modern equivalent is The Mad Psychiatrist.
Oh, yeah. Well, they are all mad. I mean, they commit suicide more than any other doctor.
And Hannibal Lecter didn't want to be cured. He sat around reading Aristotle and Plato, but he knew perfectly well they didn't talk about cannibalism, and he didn't care.
Yeah.
And this is, they're now the guardian of the soul, is the psychiatrist, not the priest. So it's the psychiatrist who can't fix his mental illness rather than the priest who can't control his sins. Because, yeah, sin is just, Alice Cooper, it's incredible that Alice Cooper would have said this, given Alice Cooper being Alice Cooper. But he became a Christian. He gave up drinking for golf, which he said was kind of a bad deal, and he became a Christian. And he said, we think we've outgrown terms like sin, but we haven't. And how could you, right? There's no other explanation for human depravities. Northrop Frye said, the record of history really surely doesn't admit of any other explanation, that there is something wrong with people. Like Alan Chesterton, there's something wrong with humans that isn't wrong with whales,
Yes.
right? You don't look at whales and say, why aren't they whaley? But when we use the word humane, there is raucous laughter coming from below because of
Yes. Yeah.
how we acted out.
I think it's a good point to finish, but we do have a serious problem on how we help, certainly the physicians we see, to get over the hump and re-engage with the moral basis of medicine. They're sitting there doing nothing and being taken apart by a small group of secularists who think they know exactly what everybody needs to do. And it simply isn't true. I've been reading Tom Sowell. I'm sure you've read him quite a lot, but I love his point about no one in the world knows even 1% of what there is to know. So the people who think of themselves as the anointed intellectuals, they have a tiny amount of knowledge compared to the whole. So the mundane knowledge held in the minds of ordinary people will make far fewer mistakes than one of these anointed people doing something like start communism.
Yes, well,
that was a wonderful.
A good place to wind up, because you finally asked me about somebody who, yes, I have indeed read. But actually, when you say what needs to be done, it brings me back to a line from Malcolm Muggeridge that I have often quoted to students, particularly from the Soviet history course. But, when everybody else was lying about Stalin, and Muggeridge went and told the truth.
Yeah.
And he was in the Ukraine during the famine, and he saw peasants on their knees in the snow begging soldiers for bread. And he went and he wrote in his journal, whatever I may say or do, I must never pretend I have not seen this. Yes. And I think in many ways the starting point for everybody is, and of course it takes courage, less for people in the West and people who might, get sent to the Gulag or the Laogai or something, but it can take a lot. It's easy to tell other people to be brave. I'll just stand behind you and watch. But we must never pretend that we have not seen this. And I think if that is the case, even with the doctors who are disturbed by what's happening in the profession, people who have seen the truth of Christianity, whatever it may be, never pretend you have not seen this. and recognize that, whatever happens, life is quite short anyway. It is disturbing to look at the calendar and figure out how many more years I get if things go well for me, if doctors do their job. And so don't act as though you're going to live for 700 or 800 years and had a whole lot of maneuvering to do in order to enjoy the earthly delights. Recognize that what matters is whether your life has integrity.
Yes.
And if
Yep.
your life has integrity, you're probably going to be okay in the short run. You'll certainly be okay in the long run. And if it doesn't, you're probably in trouble in both.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, if you see something wrong in the profession, if you think you're off track, don't be afraid to say it. And if you see something right, don't be afraid to say it. And again, as a historian, I've often pointed this out, that if you look at the course of history, the number of times that we were obviously just done, that the light was going out, everything was collapsing, and then amazingly often we have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. So I guess I'll end with Chesterton saying, Christianity's been pronounced dead on a number of occasions, but it has a God who knows his way out of the grave.
Yeah. It's astonishing to me that most doctors have never read the Nazi doctors and are not aware of the fact that the death camps were run by doctors in the SS. When centralized planning of medicine comes along, it won't be long before it's perverted again. I mean, the administrators want people to die at least 2 months earlier than they would otherwise, because they argue that's when you spend most of your healthcare dollars. They haven't even thought about what you'll have to do with the people who left behind, who connived in the early death of other people. We won't have enough psychiatrists to care for them, even if they knew what to do.
Yeah, again, it's an ugly prospect. Not to be flip, but there's a Far Side cartoon of making the rounds at the horse hospital, where they're going around with clipboards and shotguns. And from behind a curtain, you hear a blam, and all the horses are looking alarmed at it. But it's easy to get there. Again, there's a line from Jay Budachevsky about I can't remember what the specific subject is, but he said, you'll object that people aren't that logical. He says, oh, yes, they are. They're just logical slowly.
Yes.
But if the premises are wrong, the conclusions will be wrong. Sooner or later, you'll find yourself unable to fudge it.
Yes.
And so that's why you need, if something's going wrong, you need to go back to first principles and say, well, under what metaphysics would this make sense? And if I know this is wrong, again, I will not pretend I've not seen this. I know this is wrong. But if it is a logical development from these premises, then I must go back and revisit the premises. It may be an uncomfortable thing to do.
But why didn't doctors in the world's most cultured nation, why didn't they do anything about it?
Well, I mean, I'm sure a lot of them didn't get involved. A lot of them sat there thinking, I really need to do something. This is no good. But
they didn't shout about it.
Well, no, because if you did, you got killed. It's easy to say, here, you go get killed by Hitler. So I reminded, again, just many years ago in some utterly forgettable World War II movie that I watched, but somewhere in occupied Europe, this priest and this nun are going off to commit some act of resistance. And the nun says to the priest, well, Father, I hope God loves you. And the priest says, well, yes, but not so much that he wants to meet me right away.
Yes.
And so what do you, if you don't have a live faith too, and you think if the Nazis get me and kill me, it's going to be awful. I'm going to be reduced to pleading and, the horrible scenes in Lubyanka prison or in the hands of the SS, and it will be for nothing, you know? And it's terribly sad what's happening, but at least it's not happening to me. It's again, if you don't believe in an afterlife, it's kind of hard to let go of this one. I'm sorry, I don't know can we quote Woody Allen anymore?
And yet we're committing suicide more, not less.
Well, yeah, exactly. We are, and sooner or later someone will do it for us. But Woody Allen had that line about the life being like the two women in the retirement home. The one saying the food here, it's so terrible, it's so bland and yet salty and there's lumps in it. I don't even know what it is. I don't look forward to the meals at all. And the other one says yes, and such small portions too. And if you don't have that Robert Capon thing about if our exile is so full, what must our homecoming be? It's easy enough to understand why would you go and get killed? There's nothing in it for you. And so I think that's part of the thing is that you wind up, something inside you says there's meaning in life, but you're not sure what it is. And so, you haven't got something to live for. You haven't got something to die for. And again, as I say, when you think about the things they did to people in concentration camps, not just the genocidal ones, but what they did to their political prisoners, it's easy for me to sit in my study and say, oh yeah, I'd have told Himmler what was what, but that's in point of fact, a la Peter, I suspect I'd have been trembling, pale with terror and denying everything. It's easy to be brave when it's not really happening. But
Well, we must get in the habit of praying for courage then, I guess.
well, as Aristotle, first among the virtues, otherwise we exercise the others only when convenient. I mean, you hesitate to tell people you're Christian because you're afraid they're going to sneer at you, and you're thinking, well, they're not going to shoot me or anything. But at the same time, part of how do you preach the gospel? To some extent, you don't come out and say, well, I'm a Christian, repent, or else like Jonathan Rudd in the Western movie Five Card Stud. But you don't do it because it's going to put people off. But also, you don't do it because you just, you're going to become unpopular, and that's humans don't like that. It's a balancing act, and of course, you can always make cowardice seem like prudence. That's the sort of thing we are good at. And so again, as you say, we have to pray for courage, and for that I think is something very much like courage, the intellectual honesty to admit to ourselves when we're chickening out and pretending we're just biding our time.
Yeah, we need to speak truth more clearly, especially the truth where we screwed up, which we do all the while. Because then people say, well, why are you a Christian if you screw up? And I say, you just got the things the wrong way around. I don't hold on to my faith. Christ holds on to me. And when you go through black times, the one question you have to ask yourself is, have I stopped believing? And the amazing answer is, no, I haven't.
Well, it's a Job, right? I mean, if you can tough it out, presumably we're not quite in that kind of situation. Yeah, it does have that thing about, well, if I wasn't a screw up, maybe I wouldn't need help, right? And then I could be my own God because I'd be perfect in some strange way. But alas, I'm not. That's why. Do I look like a God?
I need help. Well, thank you, John.
Okay, thank you.